posture.
We'll see what happens with Venezuela. Venezuela has been very dangerous.
Venezuela is playing a dangerous game. It's allying with Russia and China, America's biggest enemies. And the United States isn't having it. With U.S. warships off Venezuela's coast and America attacking Venezuelan drug vessels, the fight is on. But how did it get to this point? And what role did Russia and China play in all this?
And U.S.-Venezuela tensions runs to a time long before Maduro.
Chavez took direct aim at President Bush, calling him a devil.
Even though Maduro has China and Russia as his supporters,
But Beijing doesn't seem to have much appetite for foreign military adventures. Vladimir Putin's Russia, on the other hand, has a proven record of using military force abroad.
Let's start with Moscow. For a long time, Russia has been a bystander in Venezuelan affairs. But a while back, it suddenly decided to actively engage with Venezuelan affairs. Unsurprisingly, it started with weapons deals. In 2008, Russia began sending over full military packages. These included thousands of rifles, fleets of helicopters, armored vehicles, fighter jets, and most importantly, the S-300 air defense system. And you have to understand that this was not outdated equipment that Russia wanted to clear out of its warehouses. For example, the S-300 was one of the most advanced platforms, designed to track aircraft across long distances and even intercept incoming missiles. And for a country in Latin America to suddenly receive something like this was unusual. And for the United States, it was deeply provocative. This move showed how serious Russia was. By giving Venezuela such a powerful system, Moscow was signaling that it was willing to provide a defensive shield that could complicate any U.S. military plan in the region. And for Hugo Chavez, who was president at the time, these deals were more than just military upgrades. He could point to each new delivery as evidence that his government was strong enough to protect the nation. But these sales weren't one-sided trades. Systems like the S-300 need constant care. They require training, spare parts, and regular maintenance. And that meant Russian advisors and experts had to be in Venezuela for years, working with local forces. So what looked like a straight trade of oil money for weapons was actually the start of a long-term dependency. Russia wanted Venezuela to rely on its technology, and Venezuela wanted Russia's strength behind it. Both sides found reasons to keep moving closer. Then Russia decided to take things further. Later that year, it sent Tu-160 bombers across the Atlantic. The Tu-160, nicknamed the Blackjack by NATO, is a nuclear-capable strategic bomber, one of the largest and most powerful in the world. You can see on this photo that 2 of them landed in Venezuela. These huge aircrafts sitting on South American runways is kind of unprecedented, and the message was simple. Russia could project power in the Western Hemisphere, something it hadn't done since the Cold War, and of course Chavez could stand proudly on the runway. Here were some of the most advanced machines in Moscow's arsenal parked on his soil. That gave him a powerful image to show both his supporters at home and his rivals abroad. But Washington found this nothing more than alarming. The thought of Russian nuclear-capable planes sitting so close to U.S. territory was difficult to ignore. You could say that on paper, the Cold War had ended decades earlier. But this scene showed the world that the rivalry between the two powers had only taken on new shapes. Not long after, Russia added another layer to its involvement. Naval ships began making port calls in Venezuelan harbors, including Caracas itself. These were warships able to launch missiles, and they had sailed across the Atlantic to dock in Venezuela. While there, they ran joint training exercises, worked with Venezuelan crews, and even held parades that looked like celebrations of a new partnership. The symbolism was impossible to miss, because the Kremlin proved that they could still project power halfway across the world and stand face-to-face with the United States in its own hemisphere. And at the same time, something else was happening that was less official but just as telling. Photos and reports started to surface, showing men wearing Wagner Group patches inside Venezuela. The Wagner Group, a private military company linked tightly to the Kremlin, has already gained a reputation for fighting in Ukraine and Syria. Now they were starting to appear in Latin America. And you have to understand that these were not the normal uniformed Russian soldiers, but rather shadowy operatives who gave Moscow a way to maintain a presence without openly admitting it. They trained Venezuelan units, provided security for political leaders, and even showed up during crackdowns on protests. And because they weren't official troops, Russia could deny involvement. But the images circulating on social media contradicted Moscow's claim. Wagner men were there, and their presence only deepened the ties between Moscow and Caracas. But Russia wasn't the only one interfering with Venezuelan affairs, as another power started to step in as well, and that was China. And you may already know this, China's style is usually different from Russia's. Moscow often shows strength through warplanes and warships and soldiers, Beijing, on the other hand, usually builds influence through money, projects, and quiet agreements. But in Venezuela, China did a little bit of both. One of the clearest signs of China's growing role in Venezuela was the building of radar stations. These were big, serious installations that could watch US fighter jets moving through the Caribbean skies and follow American naval ships sailing nearby. And this kept Washington on edge, because it meant Beijing could keep an eye on sensitive military activity right in the US's own neighborhood. In Caracas, though, the story was very different. But the Venezuelan government had pride in the fact that Chinese technology was scanning the skies, and now they could tell their people that the country was better protected, and there were now more eyes watching the horizon for any possible threat. And from there, China moved even deeper into the Venezuelan economy. While Russia brought missiles and bombers, China brought loans, bonds, construction projects, and money for infrastructure. Beijing started to finance projects in telecom, mining, and even surveillance systems. Through these tactics, Beijing secured their influence and made sure Venezuela became tied to Chinese companies and banks. I mean, can you imagine an entire network of cameras and communication lines built with Chinese technology? This basically meant that the Venezuelan government could rely on these systems to watch over its citizens and control information, let alone Beijing surveilling every move. But also at the same time, mining projects gave China access to gold and rare resources, things it always needs for its massive industries back home. This connection between Venezuela and China grew stronger through a special kind of deal often called loans for oil. The idea was simple, but also very clever. China would lend Venezuela billions of dollars, money that the government in Caracas badly needed to pay for projects, subsidies, and salaries. In return, Venezuela would pay back the loans not in cash, but instead in barrels of oil. Tankers full of Venezuelan crude were shipped to China as repayment. This gave both sides what they wanted. Venezuela got cash right away, and China secured a steady flow of oil to fuel its fast-growing economy. Of course, on paper, it looked like a win-win, but if you think about it more closely, it also meant that Venezuela was locking itself into long-term deals that gave Beijing more control. Because remember, we are still in the 2010s, and at the time, while oil prices were still high, this arrangement was safe for Venezuela. That is because oil was in demand by the Chinese. And with that money, Chavez and later Maduro would use Chinese loans to fund social programs and keep political support at home. The streets stayed calm because subsidies were paid and projects kept people busy. China, for its part, was happy to deepen its influence in Latin America, far from home but close to US borders. Each loan, each project, and each shipment of oil tightened the bond. But things would change very quickly when oil prices collapsed. Between 2014 and 2016, the value of oil went from around $100 a barrel to just $30. This was a disaster for Venezuela. Almost all of its government income came from selling oil, and suddenly that income nearly vanished. Inflation exploded, poverty spread, and the economy entered a freefall. Here is where China's earlier deals made a huge difference. Because of the loans for oil agreements, China still had a claim on Venezuela's future barrels, even when oil brought in much less money. Beijing could keep collecting oil while Caracas struggled to feed its own people. This gave China massive leverage. Venezuela could not easily walk away because it already owed too much. And this is a classic, typical Beijing move. Help struggling countries that are in desperate need with appealing deals, but then stab your partner in the back later by demanding enormous amounts of debt to be paid. It was, and has always been, in the favor of the Chinese. I mean, look at China and the rest of Latin America. Chinese hands are everywhere. So while Russia built up Venezuela's defenses and showed off military might, China basically tied Venezuela down with debts, technology, and contracts. Radar stations watched the skies. Telecom and surveillance systems kept the government in control. Mines and oil shipments fed Chinese industries. And when the crash came, all of these ties meant Beijing had more say in Venezuelan politics and economics than ever before. It was less dramatic than Russian bombers landing on runways, but in some ways it was even more powerful. Because while a bomber might leave after a few days, debts, contracts, and infrastructure can last for decades. But we've yet to address the elephant in the room in this story. While Russia and China are indeed interfering with Venezuelan foreign and domestic affairs, two men dragged the country to the state, where they are exploited from the left to right. Firstly, Hugo Chavez, the president we mentioned earlier, came to power in 1999. For him, oil became more than just a way to earn money. It became a weapon, a tool, a way to build alliances. Oil profits in those early years were huge, and Chavez wasted no time in using them to expand his influence across Latin America. He didn't just keep the money at home. Instead, he directed billions towards helping Cuba, Nicaragua, and as many as a dozen other countries. He gave them cheap fuel, subsidies, and loans. and in return, he gained their loyalty. This was the birth of his so-called oil diplomacy. On the surface, it looked generous, like one neighbor helping another, but underneath it was strategic. Every barrel of oil sent abroad was also buying influence, and those subsidies turned into friendships that could later be cashed in for political support on the international stage. This became most obvious at the United Nations. With so many small nations dependent on Venezuelan oil, Chavez could count on their votes when it came time to resist U.S. proposals. In effect, he was building an anti-U.S. bloc inside the UN, a wall of countries ready to vote with him against American interests. And of course, again and again, this didn't sit well with Washington. It was one thing for Venezuela to support Cuba or Nicaragua, but it was another thing entirely for Chavez to try reshaping global politics by handing out oil like candy. It was as if Venezuela was buying votes on the world's biggest stage, and the United States did not take it lightly. The US's response was not immediate tanks or bombers, but it came in the form of funding, strategy, and information wars. Agencies like the National Endowment for Democracy began channeling money towards Venezuelan opposition groups and independent media outlets. You have to understand, in these scenarios, the US only has one goal: to build up voices inside Venezuela that could stand against Chavez's growing power. These groups tried to report on corruption, organize protests, and present an alternative path for Venezuelans who felt smothered by the government. Washington hoped that by empowering the opposition, they could weaken Chavez's grip and maybe even push him out of office over time. Chavez, of course, saw differently. To him, it was proof that the United States was meddling in Venezuela's sovereignty, trying to pull the strings from afar and control the country like a puppet. And then, in 2009, Chavez made a move that removed all doubt about the direction he was taking. He abolished presidential term limits. Before that change, even a powerful leader like him would eventually have to step aside. But with term limits gone, Chavez could stay in office as long as he kept winning elections, and with oil money flowing, state media backing him, and the opposition weakened, the chances of him losing were slim. Many people inside Venezuela cheered, believing they had a strong leader who would protect them forever, but others saw it as the official slide into authoritarian rule. What was started as a populist movement promising fairness and justice was now turning into a system where power stayed locked in the hands of one man and his circle. At this time, the relationship between Venezuela and the United States grew even worse than ever. It was no longer just a rivalry or disagreement. It became hostile, bitter, and personal. The kind of messy divorce where both sides refused to sit at the same table. Washington accused Chavez of crushing democracy and funding enemies abroad, while Chavez accused Washington of imperialism, sabotage, and plotting coups. Every speech he gave seemed to carry sharp jabs at the US, and every action Washington took seemed designed to box him in. The tension was so thick that even ordinary Venezuelans could feel it in their daily lives, through shortages, inflation, and the constant drumbeat of propaganda on state television. But Chavez, larger than life and full of charisma, managed to hold it all together until his final years. Then, in 2013, he passed away. He left the country to Nicolás Maduro, the man who had been his loyal follower but did not carry the same energy or charm. And this is where the story of Venezuela entered a much darker chapter, because Maduro inherited not only the presidency, but also the country's deep problems. Because around the same time Maduro took power, the United States was experiencing its shale oil boom. New drilling methods meant the US was suddenly producing massive amounts of oil on its own, which killed Venezuela's most important leverage. As we discussed already, for decades, Caracas had held influence by being one of the main suppliers of oil to the US. But now Washington no longer needed Venezuelan crude. The United States became a net exporter of oil, and Maduro lost almost all bargaining power overnight. To make things even worse, global oil prices crashed between 2014 and 2016, as you know by now. But to put this into perspective, 2/3 of the Venezuelan economy vanished in just a couple of years. That was the reality facing Venezuela. Government programs that had been paid for with oil money suddenly went unfunded. Subsidies dried up. Projects stopped. Poverty spread fast. Inflation turned into hyperinflation, with prices doubling again and again until ordinary people could no longer afford basic food or medicine. Shelves in stores stood empty, and long lines stretched down the streets for bread or rice. Maduro tried to hold on, but unlike Chavez, he didn't have the personal magnetism to keep people loyal through the crisis. Chavez had been a showman, a speaker who could whip up crowds and convince them that sacrifices were worth it. Maduro lacked that skill. Instead of winning people over with charisma, he turned to force. Opposition candidates were jailed or pushed into exile. Protests were met with arrests and violence. International observers began to call the elections fraudulent, and millions of Venezuelans started to lose faith that change could ever come from the ballot box. So, to put it simply, the very thing that made Venezuela rich had become its curse. The oil diplomacy of Chavez had bought friends abroad, but it left the nation dependent on high oil prices. When those prices fell, the structure collapsed. The loans from China and the weapons from Russia gave some support, but they also tied Venezuela down with debt, and people were leaving in the millions. Shelves were empty, and the money was losing value almost by the hour. Nicolás Maduro was clinging to power, but his grip was slipping, and the United States decided to push harder than ever before. Washington's strategy was clear. If the economic collapse wasn't enough to bring down the regime, then direct pressure just might. So the US launched what became known as its maximum pressure campaign. This wasn't just another round of angry speeches or limited sanctions. It was a full effort to squeeze the Venezuelan government at every level until Maduro either gave up or was forced out. And one of the biggest steps in this campaign came in 2017, when US prosecutors charged Maduro in American courts. The charges were very serious. They said he was a drug trafficker, someone directly involved in moving narcotics across Latin America and into the United States. To make the point even stronger, Washington put a $10 million bounty on his head. That meant anyone who would capture Maduro and bring him to the US would get a fortune. You might have heard about this at the time because it was huge news. A sitting president was being treated like a cartel boss, with a wanted poster and a price tag on his capture. But it didn't stop there. Sanctions kept getting tougher, cutting Venezuela off from world markets. The last oil sales to the United States were blocked, shutting down what little money was still coming in. For a country that was almost totally dependent on oil, this was devastating. Without US buyers, and with most of the world avoiding Venezuelan crude because of sanctions, the government had almost no legal way to make money. Washington's plan was simple: starve the regime of resources until even its loyal soldiers and officials could no longer be paid. And if they couldn't be paid, maybe they would turn against. Maduro, though, was not without his tricks. Instead of giving up, he turned to the shadows. Smuggling networks became his lifeline. Drugs crossed borders, often with the help of corrupt officials. Gold was dug out of mines in the south by desperate workers and shipped quietly abroad. And oil, though blocked officially, still made its way out through back channels, sold to buyers willing to break the rules for a discount. These underground flows of cash and resources gave Maduro just enough to keep paying people close to him. Soldiers, police, and loyal politicians still got their cut. And in a system where loyalty was bought with money, that was enough to survive. And then, unexpectedly, came one of the strangest moments in this whole story. Something that almost makes it feel like it came out of a movie. In 2019, a group of mercenaries tried to land on Venezuelan beaches and overthrow the government. Among them were 2 former US Special Forces soldiers. Their plan was bold, but poorly thought out. They believed that once they landed, thousands of Venezuelan soldiers would switch sides and join them. But that's not at all what happened. The operation fell apart almost immediately. Venezuelan forces caught many of them, some were killed, and the rest were shown on state television as proof of an American-backed plot. Washington quickly said, "Oh, we had nothing to do with that raid," but the damage was already done. Maduro used the failed invasion as propaganda. He told his people that this proved how far the United States would go to remove him. The hostility grew stronger and larger. And as the years went on and pressure from the United States kept building, Venezuela started looking even more to its foreign friends for support. By this point, Russia was already deeply involved, but another powerful ally stepped in with more than just words of encouragement. That ally was Iran. Now, Iran has long been at odds with the United States, and it saw in Venezuela not only a friend in need, but an opportunity to push back against Washington right in its own backyard. So the Iranian Quds Force, which is a branch of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, began to quietly set up shop inside Venezuela. The goal was to build something concrete, something that would change the balance of power in Latin America. They started work on a drone production facility, the largest of its kind in the region. Just like Russia, these were not simple machines with small cameras. These were Shahed-style drones, the same type that had already been used by Russia in Ukraine. They were designed to carry explosives, travel long distances, and strike with accuracy. So when Iran decided to set up a drone factory in Venezuela, it was more than just a new project. It gave Maduro a tool that could be used to pressure the countries around him. During the same time, Russia's role in Venezuela remained strong. Even after years of developing weapons, flying bombers into the country, and sending naval ships across the Atlantic, Moscow found more ways to stay involved. The Wagner Group kept showing up, but the role was not limited to security during protests. They were now training elite Venezuelan forces, giving them tactics and preparing them to handle unrest if it happened. This gave Maduro's government units that were better prepared than before, and it also tied those forces more directly to Russian methods. Each new round of training made the connection between Caracas and Moscow deeper. Taken together, these moves pointed to something larger. It wasn't only Russia helping Venezuela. It wasn't only Iran building up new facilities. It was the 3 of them, Moscow, Tehran, and Caracas, forming a triangle of cooperation. Russia offered weapons, training, and political support. Iran brought drones, advisors, and infrastructure. Venezuela gave them a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a place to project power close to the United States. And this showed clearly that they were not afraid to push their presence into an area long seen as under US influence. But let's stop here for a moment. Do you remember Venezuela losing their economic power due to mismanagement and the collapse of their oil industry, and how generously Venezuela received military equipment from its so-called allies? This is the very foundation on which another problem began building, but this time on its eastern border with Guyana. This time, the focus wasn't inflation, sanctions, or shortages at home. It was about oil and territory. Guyana, a small neighbor that had rarely been central in regional politics, suddenly became one of the fastest-growing oil producers in the world, after massive offshore reserves were discovered. Estimates suggest that Guyana could soon overtake many long-standing producers. And Guyana wasn't just a country, it is a very small English-speaking country that is on good terms with the West. And with everything that has happened in Venezuela, the government reignited a centuries-old territorial claim over the Essequibo region, which covers about 2/3 of Guyana's land area. Officials declared that this was historic Venezuelan territory, and state media repeated the message daily. The goal was to turn the dispute into a unifying cause, presenting it as an issue of national pride at a moment when Venezuela's economy was collapsing. Troops were deployed to the border, military bases were expanded, and new infrastructure was built in areas that had been quiet for decades. And Guyana, with a population of less than 1 million and only around 4,000 soldiers, had no chance of defending itself against a country the size of Venezuela. Georgetown quickly sought international support. The United Kingdom, which still had historic and friendly ties with Guyana as a former colony, sent a warship to the region. The United States followed with military drills, including fighter jet flyovers and joint exercises, to show solidarity with Guyana. And with this, Caracas received the message that when they attempted to invade, it would face fierce resistance. And at the same time, Washington increased direct pressure on Nicolás Maduro. The reward for his arrest, originally set at $10 million, was raised first to $15 and then to $50 million. This placed him among the most highly targeted leaders in the world. And in Venezuela, by framing it as a matter of defending sacred territory, it rallied parts of the population and shifted attention away from hyperinflation and poverty at home. But a year later, nothing really changed, because the Maduro government was leaning harder than ever on Russia, China, and Iran just to stay afloat. Washington decided that words and sanctions alone were not enough anymore, so it turned to a very old tool of foreign policy, one that had been used many times in Latin America before. This was gunboat diplomacy. The practice of sending warships not to fight a full war, but to send a message and force the other side to move. So in early 2024, 7 US warships appeared off the coast of Venezuela. They weren't hiding or trying to slip in quietly. They were visible, deliberate, and right there for everyone to see. Now, 7 ships might not sound like much compared to a giant fleet, but the size of this deployment was important. It was too large for a simple drug operation, which usually involves Coast Guard cutters or patrol boats, not guided missile destroyers and amphibious landing vessels. At the same time, it was too small to be the start of a full invasion, which would have required an aircraft carrier, thousands more troops, and weeks of buildup. This meant the US was not preparing to invade, at least not yet. Instead, it was putting just enough power in place to make Maduro nervous, to force him to respond, and to make him spend money and resources that he could not afford to waste. If you look back to 1964, the US carried out something very similar in Brazil during what was called Operation Brother Sam. At that time, American warships sailed towards Brazil while generals inside the country moved against their president. The presence of US ships gave those generals confidence, and the president soon fled, leaving behind a military regime that Washington found much friendlier. This was nothing new for the US. They have used the threat of force to change the political balance inside the country, and this was again a nightmare for Maduro. The Venezuelan leader claimed that he had mobilized millions of armed citizens, even talking about a full republic in arms. But such claims were hard to believe. And even if partially true, mobilizing so many people would cost enormous amounts of money. Paying soldiers, moving equipment, and keeping forces on high alert drained the country's already collapsing economy. That was exactly the point from Washington's perspective. If Maduro spent his little remaining cash on preparing for a fight that never came, he would weaken himself from the inside. Generals might grow unhappy. Citizens might grow angrier. Pressure might finally reach the breaking point where people would rise up. But just as the US was increasing the heat from the outside, Russia and China stepped in once again to give Maduro a lifeline. The timing could not have been more critical. On July 28, 2024, Venezuela held elections. These elections were, again, quickly labeled fraudulent by much of the international community. The United States, the European Union, and many Latin American governments demanded transparency and asked for the detailed vote counts to be made public. The regime-aligned National Electoral Council, however, declared Maduro the winner. Almost immediately, China and Russia announced that they recognized the victory. This basically meant that Beijing and Moscow stood with Maduro, even as much of the world condemned him. But if this is a victory for Maduro, this is more than a disappointment for ordinary Venezuelans. And on the streets, protests broke out. People carried signs, demanded change, and clashed with police. In some of these protests, men wearing Wagner patches were spotted again, just as they had been in years before. Their presence, whether real Russian mercenaries or simply Venezuelan forces wearing their symbols, suggested that Moscow's influence went beyond diplomacy. It stretched into the very heart of Venezuela's security forces. Beijing, meanwhile, offered a different kind of support. Chinese companies and banks kept Venezuela plugged into alternate trade routes. Oil and gold, the last valuable exports the country still had, were shipped out quietly through allies and partners who didn't mind ignoring U.S. sanctions. This provided Maduro with enough money to keep his generals and top officials on his side. At the same time, China supported Venezuela's efforts to join BRICS, the group of large emerging economies that already included Russia, China, India, Brazil, and a few others. Membership gave Caracas a way to claim it was not isolated, but part of a broader international bloc that stood apart from U.S. influence. For Beijing and Moscow, bringing Venezuela into BRICS added another voice to their push for a world order less centered on Washington. So while American warships sat just off of Venezuela's coast, signaling pressure and forcing costly mobilizations, Russia and China chose to deepen their partnership with Maduro. What followed was a stalemate, one that left the country caught between outside threats and foreign support. But aside from politics, for everyday Venezuelans, the hardship never eased. They were left to watch their nation turn into a stage where the world's biggest powers played out their rivalry. Washington pushed for regime change, Moscow and Beijing worked to hold the government in place, and Maduro himself clung to power at any cost. And that is where Venezuela stands today. A country weighed down by crisis at home, yet locked into a struggle that stretches far beyond its border.